I forgot my keys inside the gym after closing that night. So I went back in to grab them, and just when I turned to walk back outside, look, life has a funny way of stripping you down until you don't even recognize the person looking back at you in the mirror. My name's Chris, and back in 2016, I was that guy. I'd moved out to Crestview, Ohio, one of those suburbs that feels like it's just waiting for something to happen, but nothing ever does. I'd lost my job in logistics about 6 months prior, and after 100 thank you for your interest emails, I was done. My savings were gone, and I was staring at a final notice on my electric bill that sat on my kitchen counter like a ticking bomb. I was checking my bank account every time I bought a gallon of milk, praying the transaction wouldn't decline. I wasn't looking for a career anymore. I was looking for a way to stay alive. I found the listing on a local community board online. It was barely a sentence. Manager needed for Vance's iron, walk-in only. When I saw those words, my heart actually thudded against my ribs. It felt like a literal lifeline being thrown to a drowning man. I didn't even care what the pay was. I just needed to be able to tell the landlord I had a reason to wake up in the morning. I remember staring at the screen for a solid minute, just whispering, "Please, let this be real," to the empty room. I drove over there in my 2002 Chevy Malibu. The thing was a disaster. The silver paint was oxidizing into this weird, chalky white. The headliner was sagging so low it brushed against my hair, and the engine made this rhythmic clicking sound that I knew meant a repair bill I couldn't afford. It had manual locks and a radio that only picked up one AM station clearly. Every time I turned the key, I held my breath, praying it would give me one more trip. I parked it at the end of a dead-end street that felt like it had been forgotten by the rest of the town. Crestview isn't exactly a postcard location. It's all cracked asphalt and industrial lots that have been sitting empty for years. Vance's iron sat right at the edge of that desolation, tucked behind a shuttered auto body shop where weeds were choking the chain-link fence. There were no streetlights on that block, just the gray, silent shells of old warehouses. It was a low-slung cinder block building that looked like it hadn't been painted since the Reagan administration. The windows were tinted dark and covered in a layer of grime so thick you couldn't see a silhouette inside. It didn't look like a place for fitness. It looked like a place where people went to disappear. It was around 8 p.m. when I first pushed open that heavy steel front door. The late evening sun was barely hanging on, and before I even stepped past the threshold, the atmosphere of the place hit me like a physical wall. I was greeted by the heavy metallic scent of old, oxidized iron mixed with that sour tang of stale sweat. The sound was constant, the rhythmic, aggressive clang of iron plates hitting each other somewhere in the back, and some classic rock station buzzing through a blown-out speaker. I stood there for a second, letting my eyes adjust to the terrible lighting. Half the fluorescent tubes were flickering or just dead, casting these long, twitchy shadows across the floor that seemed to move even when the room was still. I walked past the front desk, a piece of plywood with a stack of dusty waivers, and started down a long, narrow aisle lined with clunky 90s-era treadmills. To my left was a long wall of floor-to-ceiling mirrors that were starting to peel and silver at the edges. Because of the angle, I didn't see myself at first. Instead, the mirrors gave me a warped, murky reflection of the free weight zone on my right. That right side was exactly where all that aggressive clanging I'd heard at the door was coming from. As I looked past the treadmills to the actual floor, I saw how old school the setup really was. The dumbbells were mismatched, and the plates were covered in that deep orange-red rust that leaves your hands smelling like pennies after every set. The benches had cracked leather that looked like it had been taped up a dozen times. There were maybe 6 or 7 people working out, a real mix-and-match crowd scattered across those rusted machines. You had a few serious gym enthusiasts in the back, grunting through some heavy sets with total focus. And then you had a couple of older folks near the front just doing basic cardio and moving slow. Right in the center of that floor, bolted to a massive steel beam that went all the way to the ceiling, was the pull-up station. It was this jagged, industrial-looking bar that looked like it had been salvaged from a shipyard. I kept walking, passing the heavy cable machines, until I reached the far back corner where a small glass-walled office sat. I found the owner, Big Sal, sitting inside behind a metal desk covered in coffee stains and cigarette ash. He looked exactly like the building, rough, weathered, and tired. He was a massive guy, probably a competitive lifter in his prime. But now he just looked like he was made of cracked leather. He had a thick, graying beard that didn't quite hide a jagged scar running down his neck, and his hands were the size of dinner plates, calloused and stained with grease. The interview wasn't even an interview. Sal told me straight up that he'd been managing the entire place solo for years, but he was getting tied up with other business lately. Something he refused to give me any details on, and he wasn't going to be around much longer. He needed someone he could trust to take over the full operation, handling the members, the mopping, and the back office paperwork. He glanced at my resume for maybe 2 seconds before sighing and telling me the gym was barely surviving on cash from a handful of regulars. Since he couldn't afford a full staff, I was going to be the one running the show once he left for the day. It was a one-man show, but the place was small enough that it was easily manageable. Honestly, after months of nothing, I was just glad to have the keys in my hand. For the first few weeks, it was just a job. Everything was perfectly normal. I'd finish up my shift, lock the front door by 11:15 p.m., and head home to my quiet apartment. It was a boring, predictable routine that I actually started to enjoy. There was nothing out of the ordinary about the place, nothing to suggest it was any different from any other rundown gym in Ohio. But man, I wish I had just stuck to that routine. I wish I'd never stayed that extra hour. That one Tuesday night. That's the one that still keeps me awake. Look, what I'm about to tell you usually stays buried because even the memory makes my skin crawl. If you're easily unsettled, stop here. What happened past midnight in that gym isn't for the faint-hearted. It's the kind of thing that stays with you long after the lights go out. If you've got a strong heart, then stay with me, because once you hear it, you'll understand why I never went back. That Tuesday started with the same mindless physical labor that had become my new normal. I spent the early afternoon in a rhythmic, sweaty grind, dragging rusted 45-pound plates across the floor and restacking them. The members at Vance's treated the weight zone like a scrapyard, and after the last few weeks of doing nothing but staring at 4 walls in my apartment, I actually leaned into the physical ache. By late afternoon, around 4 p.m., the gym hit that awkward lull where the building feels hollow. To kill the boredom, I sat behind the plywood front desk in a cycle of distractions, playing a quick match of Clash Royale and then immediately checking my notifications. I'd been messaging a girl named May on Bumble for about 5 days, and during those dead hours, the conversation suddenly intensified. We were hitting it off in a way that made me forget I was sitting in a cinder block box. I found myself staring at the screen, waiting for her next reply. By 8 p.m., the energy finally shifted. The evening rush was the busiest I'd seen it, about 14 or 15 members packed into that small, humid space. The air was thick with the scent of copper and stale sweat. I stayed busy, nodding to the regulars and keeping the floor clear, but I kept feeling my phone vibrate. May and I had finally agreed to have our first actual call once I finished my shift. By close to 11 p.m., the crowd had thinned until only Miller was left. Miller was the anchor of my nights, a retired guy who spent his final hour pedaling slow on the stationary bike. Normally, when he'd finish up, I'd be right behind him, locking the door and heading to my Malibu. But that night, I stayed. I didn't want to go home to my apartment yet. Even though I'd been working for 3 weeks, I was still underwater from months of unemployment, and my kitchen counter was a graveyard of final notice letters. Sitting in that gym office, I felt like a manager. I felt like a guy who finally had a purpose, and I didn't want to ruin the vibe of my first call with May by sitting in a dark room that reminded me how broke I still was. I felt more confident here. I sat back in the creaky office chair and dialed her number. We were on the phone for over an hour. We talked about everything: getting out of Ohio, movies, that shared feeling of being stuck. I was so focused on May's voice that the dark gym on the other side of the glass-walled office completely vanished. When I finally hung up, the clock hit 12:30 a.m. I hit the master switches, plunging the gym into a heavy, absolute darkness. I walked through the pitch-black aisle of treadmills by memory, stepped out into the humid night, and heard the heavy bolt click into place. I walked over to my Malibu, reached into my pocket to pull out my fob, and my heart just stopped. I patted my front right pocket, empty. I jammed my hand into the left, then the back pockets of my jeans, frantically feeling for the jagged outline of my keychain. I checked the front pocket of my light hoodie, then patted my chest, my breathing hitching as I realized there was no metallic jingle. Oh damn, I think I forgot my keys inside, I whispered into the dead silence of the street. Since it was late April in Ohio, the night air was just crisp enough that I'd kept my hoodie on, but now the fabric felt like it was suffocating me as I realized I had to go back in. I stood there on that dead-end street, staring back at Vance's iron. Without the streetlights, the building looked like a giant, solid block of obsidian, a black void absorbing the moonlight. My skin began to crawl. My gut wasn't just whispering, it was screaming, "Don't go back in there." "Come on, Chris," I whispered to myself, my voice sounding thin in the empty street. "This is the same gym you're in every day. You've never felt weird or scared here. It's just a building." But as I looked at those dark windows, I knew I was lying. Something was just off. It felt as if the building had been waiting for the lights to go out so it could become something else, something predatory. I stood there for 2 full minutes, terrified of a place I spent 40 hours a week in. I needed those keys. I unlocked the front door and stepped back in. The darkness inside wasn't just an absence of light, it was heavy, like liquid. I thought about reaching for the master panel, but the idea of those massive halogen bulbs humming to life and announcing my return to the entire block made my stomach turn. I didn't want to be in a fishbowl. I knew this floor by heart. I didn't need the light. I just needed to move. The silence inside wasn't empty. It felt occupied, as if the air itself was thick with a presence that shouldn't have been there. To keep my nerves from shattering, I started humming a random low tune under my breath. I didn't bother turning on my phone light. I didn't want to waste a second fumbling with a screen. My pace was fast, my sneakers making a hurried, rhythmic squeak, squeak, squeak as I power walked through the ink. I eventually reached the far back corner where the office was located. With every step, I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise, a sickening feeling that I was racing against a clock I couldn't see. I stepped into the office and clicked on the small desk lamp. In case I haven't really described the office layout, let me tell you guys because it's important. The office was essentially a glass-walled cube. The heavy metal desk was an L-shaped unit, and I was standing at the side, pushed directly against the main interior glass wall, a massive observation window facing the gym floor. The light from the lamp felt like a sanctuary, but only for a second. I fumbled through the mess on the table, my heart hammering against my ribs. I shoved aside a stack of membership waivers, searched under a discarded clipboard, and finally found them, buried under a pile of scrap paper near the stapler. I grabbed them, the cold brass feeling like a prize, and I let out a shaky breath. I turned around, my hand hovering over the lamp switch, ready to plunge the gym back into darkness. And then I heard it creak. It wasn't a quick sound. It was the slow, agonizing groan of metal under extreme tension coming from the center of the dark floor. My humming died instantly. My throat was a desert. In the movies, this is where the guy shouts, "Hello, who's there?" or "Sal, is that you?" But the words wouldn't come. My survival instinct was screaming at me to stay silent. A sane person knows that if they speak, they are just confirming their location to a predator. I stayed frozen in the office doorway. Because the office lamp was angled toward the glass wall, it acted like a searchlight, throwing a long, yellowish cone of light directly across the gym floor, ending right at the shipyard pull-up bar. Anything outside that specific path was a sea of ink. In the center of that dim spill of light, I saw a mass, a silhouette hanging from the bar. Initially, I couldn't make out what it was. The proportions were all wrong. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe a heavy bag had slipped from its hook. I leaned forward, my stomach pressing against the cold, hard edge of the metal desk, moving my face inch by inch toward the glass wall. I wiped away a split second of fog from my breath with a trembling hand, peering into the gloom. The mystery peeled away into a nightmare. It was a woman in a simple, white sundress, her back turned toward me. Her hair was incredibly long, matted, damp, and hanging down in dark, heavy clumps that completely obscured her neck. She wasn't just hanging. She was mid-workout. I watched in paralyzed horror as she lowered herself in a slow, agonizingly controlled descent until her right arm was fully extended. Her legs weren't hanging straight. They were hitched at the knees, her ankles crossed in a perfect pull-up form to keep her bare feet from scraping the floor. Every muscle in her back rippled and flared under the white fabric. Then, with a guttural, wet grunt, the kind of sound a person makes when their body is pushed past the point of failure, she hauled herself back up. She was lifting a freakishly wide frame, shoulders broader than any professional bodybuilder I'd ever seen. She had to weigh at least 150 to 200 kilograms, a solid slab of power and horror. She did this with only her right arm, while her left arm hung completely limp at her side, like a slab of raw meat. Draped over her thick neck like a heavy scarf were two industrial towing chains, the rusted links glinting as they grazed the floor with a heavy, dull thud at the bottom of the rep, then clinked against the steel bar at the top. A wet, rattling grunt of absolute physical strain, the sound of air being forced through a constricted throat at the breaking point of exertion, immediately followed by a sharp, heavy clink. My legs began to shake so violently I had to grab the edge of the desk to keep from falling. I first thought of just sliding under the metal desk, but looking at those glass walls, I realized I'd just be cornering myself in a cage. If she came in here, there would be no struggle. It would be a total physical erasure. The office was a dead end. To get to the front door, I had to walk right down that narrow treadmill aisle, straight through her field of vision. There was no other choice. I had to bolt while her back was still turned. I clutched my keys so tightly, the jagged brass bit into my palm. I didn't dare reach for the lamp switch. I left it burning, a tiny useless yellow beacon in the void. I couldn't waste the 2 seconds it would take to turn it off. My hand was already white-knuckled on the office door handle, ready to bolt, but my eyes were locked on her silhouette through the glass to track her every move. I shifted my weight, trying to find the courage to run, but my sneaker caught the edge of a stray rubber mat. A sharp, wet pop of suction as the rubber breaks its seal with the damp floor. In a building this hollow and silent, the suction sound was like a gunshot. The creaking stopped. She didn't drop from the bar immediately. She stayed suspended by that one massive arm, her body perfectly still. Then I watched her head begin to tilt. She tilted it back and way to the side, her nose twitching, visibly sniffing the air as if she could catch my scent across the room. I couldn't see her eyes through the matted hair, but I felt her focus lock onto the light pouring out of my office window. I didn't think anymore. I bolted. I burst out of the office and sprinted down the treadmill aisle, leaving the office door swinging wide behind me. I didn't look back, but I heard the release. A massive, singular thud echoed through the empty space as she dropped from the bar. Then came the thuds of something hitting the floor behind me. I never turned around to confirm she was actually in pursuit. I was too terrified to know for sure, but the sound was unmistakable. Thud, thud, thud. The floorboards literally vibrated. It sounded like something weighing well over 100 kilos sprinting full speed on the balls of its feet. I slammed into the emergency push bar of the front door, threw myself into the night, and heard the bolt of the heavy steel door hiss shut behind me, just as a massive weight slammed into the other side of it. I didn't stop running until I was inside my Malibu. My hands were shaking so hard I couldn't get the key into the ignition. I was gasping, my eyes glued to that gym door, expecting it to burst off its hinges at any second. I finally felt the engine roar to life. I pressed on the gas as hard as I could, the tires screaming as I tore away from that dead-end street. I took one last terrified peep at the side mirrors. I didn't see her emerge, but the receding black block of Vance's iron stood there in the dark, watching me go. I didn't head home, not immediately. The thought of my silent, dark apartment, the same four walls that had felt like a tomb during my months of unemployment, now felt like a trap. I drove. I pushed my Malibu through the empty Ohio streets for over 30 minutes, my hands still fused to the steering wheel, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see a flash of white sundress in the back seat. I was mindlessly navigating a loop of dead-end roads and strip malls, totally lost in my own adrenaline. I finally pulled into my apartment complex around 2 a.m. I didn't even bother taking off my shoes. I collapsed onto the couch and hit every light switch within reach. I couldn't afford the darkness anymore. I needed the harsh, artificial glow to prove I was alone. But even with the lights burning, the visions recurred in a sickening loop. The corded muscles of her back, the way her head tilted to sniff the air, the heavy metallic thud of her landing on the floorboards. I eventually fell into a leaden, twitchy sleep, the lamp still humming above me. I woke up late the next morning to the persistent vibration of my phone. 6 missed calls, 5 messages, all from Sal. My stomach turned. I knew I couldn't go back, not for a shift, and definitely not at night. I picked up the phone and sent a text, my fingers trembling as I typed out a desperate lie. Sal, I am so sorry, but I've had a major family emergency come up. I have to leave Ohio tomorrow morning. Is there any way I can stop by today to pick up my pay for the 3 weeks I've worked? I know the pay cycle is monthly, so feel free to deduct whatever you need for the lack of notice, but I really need the cash before I hit the road. Sal, surprisingly, was the nice guy I had first met. He texted back almost immediately. I'm so sorry to hear that, kid. Don't worry, family's the most important thing. I'll arrange the cash for you now. Just come by in an hour or two and grab it. Under any other circumstances, I would never have stepped foot in that building again. I would have walked away from every cent just to keep that place out of my sight. But I was desperate. I was still underwater from the months of unemployment, and those final notice letters on my counter weren't going to pay themselves. 2 hours later, I pulled back onto that dead-end street. In the daylight, Vance's Iron looked ordinary, just a weathered cinder block building. But my skin still crawled as I stepped inside. I didn't look around. I kept my head down, my eyes fixed on the cracked linoleum floor, deliberately refusing to let my gaze drift toward the center of the gym where the pull-up bar stood. I walked straight past the shipyard area and headed directly into Sal's office. Sal was there, leaning against his metal desk. He handed me the envelope, thanked me for the help, and said I'd been a great asset to the place. I just wanted to grab the cash and run, but as I turned to leave, he stopped me. "Hey, Chris," he said, his voice dropping into a confused, low tone. "Did you notice anything weird before you locked up last night?" My heart skipped. I stayed quiet for a long, heavy second. I couldn't tell him. I couldn't tell anybody. Being labeled as insane was the last thing I wanted at that point. I was a guy who needed a career, a future. If word got out that I was seeing things in the dark, I'd never find work again. I had to bury it. No, I finally lied, my face a mask of professional indifference. It was fine when I left. Why? Sal just shook his head and pointed toward the center of the floor. The shipyard pull-up bar. Look at it. Maybe some kids broke in. I mean, I don't even know how they would have done it. They'd need a hydraulic jack to bend that shipyard bar, but it's warped right in the center. I had no choice. I was forced to look at the industrial steel bar Sal was pointing at. It was the same bar I had seen her on just hours before. It was bent, not just a little. It was bowed right in the center, like someone had hung a literal engine block from it. That steel was rated for 500 pounds, and now it was warped into a permanent, sickening curve. I didn't say a word. I just nodded, took my money, and started walking toward the exit. As I moved down the aisle toward the front gate, the shipyard bar sat to my left. I couldn't help it. I took one final, involuntary glance at the twisted metal. Seeing that bow in the steel, that cold, physical proof, shattered whatever was left of my denial. It was real. She was actually there. It's been years now. I've moved on, found a new career, and left Ohio far behind. But the questions still haunt my quietest moments. What was that thing? Was it a woman or something that just knew how to look like one? And something else really scares me. Did she know I was there the whole time? The office lamp was on. The gym was a fishbowl. Maybe she knew I was already trapped, just a cornered animal she chose to ignore because the workout was more important than the kill. If she had come for me, I'd be dead. And why? Why was she only using one arm? That thought has never left me. Today, even in the safety of my own home, the slightest noise in the dark, a floorboard creaking or the wind catching a door, totally rattles me. Because I know that when the lights go out, the world we think we know is just a thin veil. And somewhere in the ink, something is always mid-rep, waiting for the silence to begin.